And the rest of the story is on my YouTube channel. Channel name in the profile header. So, I posted about this a few days ago in another thread, but people seemed interested, so I figured I'd tell the full story. It's not the scariest thing ever, but it still weirds me out to this day. I was around 12 or 13 when this happened. Just a normal kid, living in a normal house, with normal parents who had a totally normal reaction to waking up to their child covered in blood. But I'll get to that in a second. That night, nothing felt off. No weird noises, no sleep paralysis, no creepy dreams, just me, passing out like usual after staying up way too late watching TV. I remember waking up because my face felt wet. Not in a painful way, just wet. Groggy, half asleep me assumed I had drooled all over myself, which, gross, but whatever. But when I rubbed my cheek, my hand came away dark and sticky. That's when I sat up and saw it. Blood. Everywhere. My pillow was smeared with it. My sheets had streaks of red. I remember feeling my face again, trying to figure out what was going on, but there was no pain, just warm liquid still running down my cheek. And that's when panic set in. Still half asleep and totally freaking out, I jumped out of bed and stumbled down the hall to my parents' room. I must have looked like something out of a horror movie, barefoot, in my old pajama shirt, blood smeared across my face like some creepy ghost kid. I barely got out of Mom, before she turned on the bedside lamp and screamed. My dad jolted awake like someone had just hit him with a defibrillator. He took one look at me and immediately launched into full-on dad mode, jumped out of bed, grabbed a towel, and pressed it against my face while bombarding me with questions. What happened? Did you fall? Are you hurt anywhere else? I was trying to answer, but I was still in shock. I wasn't even sure what happened. I kept telling them I didn't feel anything, that I just woke up like this. And that only freaked them out more. My mom rushed me to the bathroom, flipped on the light, and carefully pulled the towel away from my face. That's when we saw it, a deep, clean cut right near my eye. It wasn't just a little scratch. It was bad. Bad enough that I was definitely going to need stitches. Part 3 coming soon. At this point, my mind was spinning, but I had to stay calm because my parents were starting to lose it. My mom was making frantic calls to the emergency room, and my dad was trying to inspect the cut like he was some kind of DIY surgeon. I remember looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, seeing the blood soaking through the towel and just not understanding how it happened. I couldn't feel the cut at all. No stinging, no pain, nothing. Just blood, dripping down my face like it was normal. So, of course, the first thing I did was try to figure out what caused it. Maybe I'd scratched myself in my sleep? But that didn't make sense because I hadn't had any weird dreams or freaky episodes the night before. I pulled my parents into the bedroom, and we started looking around. We checked the sheets, the pillowcase, the edges of the bed, the floor, everything. The only thing we found was a tiny little shard of glass under the edge of the bed. It was so small that it barely even seemed like it could have caused the cut. But my mom was convinced it had something to do with it, so she was ready to tear the whole room apart to find more clues. Meanwhile, I was still staring at my reflection in the bathroom, trying to wrap my head around it. It didn't add up. I'd never felt pain. I hadn't gotten out of bed during the night. So, how the hell had I ended up like this? But we didn't have time to dwell on that. My dad, now looking like he was about to pass out from stress, told my mom to take me to the ER, so off we went. We got to the ER at 3 a.m., and let me tell you, nothing screams you're in for a night of chaos like an emergency room at that hour. It was crowded, loud, and honestly, kind of terrifying. I'd never been to the ER for anything serious before, so this was a first for me. I remember sitting in the waiting room, feeling weirdly numb to the whole thing. I wasn't scared for myself, but I could see how freaked out my parents were, and that made me more anxious. My mom was pacing back and forth like she was about to break down, and my dad kept looking at the cut and muttering about how it was worse than he thought. Finally, they called my name, and we were whisked into a small room with the most bored-looking nurse ever. She barely looked up from her clipboard as she told me to sit on the bed. She checked the cut, and her reaction was about as enthusiastic as if she'd just seen a paper cut. Yeah, that'll need stitches. We'll get someone in here to take care of that. I was just sitting there, still trying to figure out what the heck happened, and now I was starting to feel a little annoyed. I knew this wasn't just some random cut. There had to be something more to it. But every time I tried to explain how I didn't feel any pain or how none of it made sense, my parents just looked at me like I was crazy. It felt like I was the only one who thought this was strange. After what felt like forever, a doctor finally walked in, looking way too calm for the situation. I was half expecting someone to rush in, take control, and be like, "We've got a mystery on our hands." But no, this guy strolled in like he was about to do a routine checkup. "Let me take a look at this," he said, examining my cut with way more casualness than I was comfortable with. Honestly, I was starting to feel like maybe I was overreacting, but something about the whole thing still felt off. "Alright," he continued after a moment, "this is going to need stitches. It's a deep one, but nothing too crazy. I'll numb it up a bit, so you won't feel anything." So, they numbed the area around my eye. I'm not sure if it was the numbing or just my nerves, but I suddenly realized how quiet the room was. My parents were just standing there, kind of awkwardly, while the doctor worked. Then came the stitching. It didn't hurt, thankfully, but the whole experience was bizarre. I mean, I'm just lying there, staring at the ceiling while this guy stitches my face up, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong about the whole situation. I just kept replaying the events in my head, how I woke up with no pain, how we couldn't find any clear cause for the cut, and how the hell I didn't feel a thing. And here I was, getting stitched up like it was no big deal. So, after the stitches were done, the doctor gave me some instructions about taking care of the wound, warned me about not getting it wet, and then basically kicked us out of the ER. My face was throbbing now that the numbness had worn off, but I still felt this weird emptiness inside, like something had been left unsaid. We drove home in silence. My mom kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror like she was trying to figure out if I was okay, but I couldn't read her. Dad was just focusing on the road, but I could tell he was replaying the night in his head too. We all were, but none of us were saying anything. When we got home, we finally had a moment to breathe. My parents helped me settle back into my room, but the weirdest thing was, nothing felt normal anymore. It was like the whole house had shifted in this unsettling way. I went to bed that night with a bandage on my face, but the whole experience kept nagging at me. How had I gotten that cut? Was it just a freak accident? Could something have happened in my sleep that I didn't remember? The thought that I could have injured myself that badly without any recollection was almost worse than the cut itself. For the next few days, I tried to move on. The cut healed, but the mystery didn't. My parents were constantly asking if I remembered anything else from that night, but I couldn't give them an answer. The sheets, the pillow, nothing had been out of place other than that tiny shard of glass. But here's the thing, we still don't know what happened. So here's the part that really gets under my skin. After all the hoopla, all the trips to the ER, all the worry, we still couldn't figure out what caused the damn cut. We searched every possible corner of my room, checked the bed again, looked under the mattress, and even dug through my drawers like we were looking for buried treasure. Nothing. It was so frustrating because we were so sure the shard of glass had something to do with it. But that glass was tiny. Like, really tiny. There was no way it could have caused such a clean, deep cut near my eye, right? My parents weren't as freaked out as they were the night it happened, but I could tell they were still troubled. They'd mention it in passing, like at dinner or while we were watching TV together, but no one was actually trying to dig deeper. It was like they just wanted to move on, to forget the whole thing ever happened. But for me? I couldn't stop thinking about it. I mean, what if there was something more to it? What if there was something that happened that night, something I didn't remember, something that could explain how I woke up with no pain, no awareness of what had happened, but with blood running down my face? I don't know if I'll ever get an answer, but the questions never really went away. So, after a few days of not getting any answers, I started to wonder if I was going a little crazy. My brain was looping the same questions over and over, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing was adding up. I mean, I wasn't the type to believe in paranormal stuff or anything, but my mind started wandering down that road. I kept thinking, what if there's something weird in my room? Like, I'm not talking ghosts or anything too outlandish, but maybe some kind of energy or force I couldn't explain. I know it sounds ridiculous. But when you wake up covered in blood with no idea how it happened, your brain starts going to some pretty weird places. And of course, my parents were no help. They were trying to be practical about it, which meant they kept telling me to just move on and stop worrying about it. But I couldn't just move on. There was a hole in the story, and I couldn't let it go. The idea that I might have cut myself in my sleep didn't sit well with me. I've never been a sleepwalker. I don't have a history of sleep injuries. So, this whole thing felt off. But my mind kept circling around the same thought. Maybe there was something about that night that I wasn't remembering. Maybe it was something I blocked out. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe something happened that I'm just not meant to understand. A couple of weeks passed, and I almost started to put it out of my mind. I was back to school, back to hanging out with my friends, and life was slowly returning to normal. But then one night, I had this weird flashback. It was late, and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to fall asleep. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I had this vivid image in my head, like a snapshot from that night. It wasn't just a memory, it was almost like I was reliving it. I was back in my room, in my bed, but something felt off. It was dark, and I could feel the air around me heavy, suffocating. I saw myself lying in bed, but I wasn't asleep. In this flash, I wasn't just imagining the blood or the cut near my eye. I saw something else. For a split second, I could swear I saw a figure at the edge of my bed. It wasn't fully formed, but there was this presence, this shadowy figure that seemed to be watching me. I don't know how long I was staring at it in my flashback, but it felt like an eternity. And then I snapped back to reality, heart racing, hands shaking. I couldn't breathe for a second. I didn't know what to think. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined all of that? Or worse, was something actually there that night? I don't know. But I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe something had happened, and I just wasn't supposed to know what it was. So, after that flashback, I started obsessing over what I had seen or thought I had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, but every time I brought it up to my parents, they just dismissed it. I'd talk about the strange flashback, the shadowy figure, and my mom would just sigh and say, "You've been through a lot, honey. You probably just imagined it." But I couldn't drop it. Something about it all felt real. I wasn't the type to jump to wild conclusions, but the more I thought about that moment, the figure, the weird atmosphere, the more convinced I became that something odd had happened. So, I decided to do my own digging. Late at night, when everyone else was asleep, I started combing through every corner of my room again. I checked the bed, the nightstand, the floor under the bed, nothing out of place. But I couldn't stop looking. Maybe I was being irrational, but I had to know what happened. Then, on one of my late-night investigations, I found something strange. It was tucked under my bed, way in the back, where I couldn't have possibly missed it during our earlier searches. A small, metal object half buried in dust. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of it, so I pulled it out. It was a small, bent piece of metal, and it looked like it could have been part of an old picture frame or something. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the sharp edge. I could have sworn the cut on my face was made by something sharp, and now, this piece of metal was giving me that same eerie feeling. But again, how could I have missed it before? So now I was really freaking out. I'm not gonna lie, finding that metal piece under my bed felt like finding a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit. It didn't make sense. How had I missed it before? How had it been hidden so perfectly under my bed? It wasn't big, but it was definitely sharp, and it looked like it could have caused the cut near my eye. But here's the thing, I had never seen this metal object before. It wasn't like anything I'd had in my room. I don't remember ever owning a picture frame that could have fallen apart like this, and I definitely didn't remember a sharp piece of metal in my bed. I held it in my hand, staring at it, trying to piece it all together. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no way that this was a coincidence. The metal piece, the cut, the blood, it all felt too connected to just be random. I went to my parents the next morning and showed them what I'd found. "Where did this come from?" I asked them, my voice shaky. Do you recognize it? They both looked at it for a moment, and then exchanged a glance. Maybe it's just part of an old frame or something, my dad said, but even he didn't sound convinced. He reached for it, turning it over in his hand, but he wasn't giving me any answers. But there was one thing he said that stuck with me. You sure you didn't just cut yourself while cleaning or moving stuff around? I immediately shot that idea down. I hadn't been cleaning, I hadn't been moving anything in my room. I had no memory of any of that. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but my parents weren't giving me anything concrete. Despite my parents' dismissal, the metal piece stayed in my mind. It was bugging me, and no matter how many times I tried to forget about it, I couldn't. The idea that I could have somehow caused the cut myself while cleaning or moving things just didn't sit right. I knew something had happened that night, something that I wasn't remembering. But what? What was I missing? I started obsessing over little things that didn't make sense at the time. For example, the fact that I didn't feel any pain when I woke up. How could I have had such a deep cut, and yet not have felt it? Why was the blood running down my face if I didn't remember getting hurt? And then there was the strange sense of unease I couldn't shake. It wasn't just about the injury anymore. It felt like there was something else, something bigger at play. Maybe it was just my mind running wild, but part of me was starting to wonder if I had missed some kind of sign. So, in my typical I can't let this go fashion, I decided to do what any curious 13-year-old would do. I turned to the internet. I started researching strange injuries, people waking up with unexplained cuts, things like that. I stumbled upon a few odd forums where people had described similar experiences. At this point, I was getting desperate for answers. The more I thought about the metal piece, the more questions piled up. How had it ended up under my bed, and why had I never noticed it before? Was I just being paranoid, or was there something genuinely off about the whole situation? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, the blood, the cut, the weird flashback with the shadowy figure, and now this strange metal object. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial, some piece of the puzzle that would explain everything. Around 2 a.m., I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and went back into my room. I wasn't just going to sit around wondering anymore. I was going to find the truth, whatever that truth might be. I crawled under my bed, once again searching for anything that could explain what had happened. I checked the corners, the cracks, the places where dust usually accumulates, but nothing. There was nothing new. I kept the flashlight on the metal piece I found earlier, still wondering if it was connected somehow, but it wasn't enough. I needed more. So I stood up and started examining my room from a new angle. I went over every object, my bookshelf, the drawers, the little trinkets on my nightstand. I even checked the corners of the ceiling. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had this nagging feeling that there was something I'd missed the first time. And then, I found something. Hidden behind my bookshelf, tucked in the farthest corner of the room, was a small, torn piece of paper. I pulled it out and unfolded it. It was barely legible, but I could make out a few words. Get rid of the rest. I stood there, staring at the piece of paper in my hands, trying to make sense of it. My heart was racing because, for the first time since all of this started, I felt like I was finally on the verge of something important. The words, get rid of the rest, were scribbled messily, like whoever wrote it was in a rush. The paper was old and frayed at the edges, like it had been hiding there for years. It didn't look like anything I'd written, and it definitely didn't look like anything my parents would have left behind. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was this a clue? Was this connected to what had happened to me that night? I immediately went to my parents' room, my hands trembling as I held the paper in front of them. Mom, Dad, do you recognize this? I asked, voice shaky. They both looked at it for a second before they exchanged a glance. That glance was enough to tell me they knew something they weren't telling me. Where did you find this? My dad asked, his tone serious. I told him I'd found it behind my bookshelf, and he went completely still. We need to talk, he said quietly. My mom looked like she was about to say something, but she stopped herself, her face pale. She just nodded. My mind was spinning. What was going on? What did this piece of paper mean? And why were my parents acting so weird about it? My parents led me into the living room, their faces a mix of concern and reluctance. I could tell they were holding something back, something big. I felt a pit forming in my stomach, and my mind raced with possibilities. Was this the moment when they'd finally tell me the truth? "We didn't want to scare you," my dad began, his voice low and careful, like he was trying to choose every word carefully. "But we need to explain a few things." My mom stayed quiet, her eyes downcast, her hands folded in her lap. "Do you remember when you were younger, about 8 or 9, my dad continued. You had a few strange episodes. Nightmares, sleepwalking, things like that." I nodded. I remembered some weird nights, times when I woke up in odd places or had dreams that felt too real. But it wasn't anything that stuck with me. It was just part of growing up, right? "Well," my dad said, his voice tightening, "after that, we started to notice something strange. You started getting hurt, small injuries, scratches, cuts, just like the one on your face." I felt a chill run through me. What was he talking about? "Sometimes, you'd wake up with no memory of how they happened," he went on. "At first, we thought you were just clumsy or you were hurting yourself in your sleep. But then it got worse. We realized you didn't just hurt yourself, you were getting injured by something else." My brain started to buzz. Injured by something else? What did that even mean? My mom spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "There were things we couldn't explain, things we didn't understand. It got to the point where we had to do something." I stared at them, the weight of their words sinking in. "What are you saying?" Dad took a deep breath. "The truth is, we didn't want to scare you, but there's something about your room, something in the house, that's connected to these injuries. It's not just a coincidence. And that note, well, it was from the last time we tried to make it stop." My heart skipped a beat. Make it stop? What are you talking about? They exchanged another look, and then my dad finally said the words that froze me in place. "There's something in this house that shouldn't be here. And we've been trying to get rid of it for years." The room felt like it was closing in on me as my parents' words hung heavy in the air. "Something in the house that shouldn't be here?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. My dad nodded solemnly. "It's hard to explain, but when we moved into this house, strange things started happening. At first, it was just little things moving, noises in the night, stuff we brushed off as old house quirks. But then you started getting hurt, and that's when we realized it wasn't just coincidence. There's something attached to this place, something dark." My mom finally spoke up, her voice shaky but determined. "We didn't want to scare you or put too much on your shoulders, but after what happened to you, we couldn't hide it anymore. We've been trying to get rid of whatever it is for years. We've had people come in to cleanse the house, but it never works. It's always there, lurking." I could feel the weight of their words pressing on me. A dark presence? All this time, I thought it was just a random injury, a freak accident. But now it seemed like there was something much bigger at play. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why didn't you warn me?" "We thought you'd be safer not knowing," my dad explained. "We didn't want you to be scared, but now it's clear it's affecting you again." I was silent for a long moment, trying to process everything. The strange cut, the flashbacks, the weird feeling that something had been wrong in my room, all of it started to make sense in a way that terrified me. "So, what do we do now?" I finally asked, the question hanging heavy between us. My mom stood up and took a deep breath. "We need to leave this house, for good. We can't keep living like this." It was a difficult decision, but I knew deep down it was the only way. The house we'd lived in for years, the place I'd thought was home, was now the place that held something sinister, something we couldn't explain or control. "We'll move," my dad said quietly. "We'll start fresh. It's the only way we'll be safe." And so, we did. It wasn't easy, and there was still a lingering fear about what had happened, but we packed up our lives and left the house behind. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand what happened that night or why those injuries started happening to me. But leaving the house, leaving that part of my life behind, felt like the only real way to move forward. To anyone out there who's dealing with strange occurrences, my advice is this: trust your instincts. If something feels off, don't ignore it. And sometimes, you have to take the hard step to move on from what's holding you back, even if that means walking away from something you thought was safe. And as for the house? It's been years, but I still think about it sometimes. Wondering if that thing, whatever it was, still lingers there, waiting for the next person to move in. But that's a story for another time.